Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined as always by my fantastic co-hosts. Up first, he played an Outlaws deck against his in-laws. It's Matt Morgan.
Joey, I was trying to make an appointment with my chiropractor the other day, and they said, sorry, I'm all booked up. I've got back-to-back appointments. Couldn't get in.
Oh, man. Well, hopefully it's not too much of a stretch for you to be able to finally get an appointment there.
I think they can handle it, though. They have a lot of hands-on experience with scheduling problems, so...
I mean, it takes a lot of spine to do that job.
Oh, no. All right. And up next, he's tickled by the fact that, according to the rules of Thunder Junction, attacking me for 15 damage doesn't actually count as committing a crime. It's Dana Roach.
I finally got a chance this weekend to see Dune Part 2. And it's fantastic, but here's the thing about cliffhangers.
Go on.
No, I'm letting that one sink in. That was terrific. That was great. I'm way into that.
Dana's going to keep that joke going the rest of the episode.
Yes, we're just going to sit here in silence the entire hour we're recording.
It's very, I see you shiver with anticipation. Anyway, Matt, What are we talking about in this episode?
Well, this week, we're going to talk about some cards maybe in the social settings that maybe you should be disclosing with people during those Rule Zero conversations, because maybe sometimes some of these cards, they're not the best to surprise other players with.
Yeah, absolutely. What are we calling this one? Cards you should disclose, things that, it's polite to give a heads up about. I think this will be a really interesting one. I'm excited to talk about it with you guys. But before we get to it, we've got some shout outs to do. First and foremost, we got to thank Chase, aka Manicurves, for their terrific work on the post-production of the show. Chase, it's so much fun editing with you. Thank you so much, Manicurves.
We're also now proud members of Team Ultimate Guard. It's really nice to be able to recommend a product we actually use, and we all actually use Ultimate Guard's products. After I tried their katana sleeves for the first time, I re-sleeved all 23 of my decks in their sleeves, and by I re-sleeved, I mean my son re-sleeved. And it's been worth every minute of the time he spent doing it. So the product is fantastic, and I'd recommend having your children re-sleeve all of your decks and katanas as well.
I have discomfort, but I also recommend katana sleeves. They're very, very good. But Dana, what a weird way to pitch that.
And if you're curious how long it takes to re-sleeve 23 decks, almost exactly the runtime of the live-action One Piece.
Wow. All right. Good to know. Good to know.
Well, Dana, I know that there's one piece of feedback I would give folks if they want to support us, maybe. Several of those ways are just free things that you can do, whether it's subscribing on YouTube, liking this video, subscribing to your local podcast apps, or you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast and ask yourself a question man, why would I want to watch this on Friday when I can watch this episode a day early? And you can do that by going to patreon.com/EDHRECast. You can get all sorts of other perks as well, whether it's joining our Discord community. They have an awesome time just picking up games pretty much throughout whatever time of day too, which is kind of wild, but kind of amazing too. So if you want to get some perks for yourself while supporting the show, go over to patreon.com/EDHRECast, and you can also get your name in the running to be the weekly patron shout out. So this week, Max Rickard, thank you so much for your support. I almost thought it was Rick Deckard for a second, and I got really excited that somebody would actually be named that, but turns out Blade Runner babies don't actually exist.
Whereas I thought it was Richard Marx at first, and I was waiting for you to drop a Right Here Waiting reference for us, Matt.
That reference was not waiting for me, so...
You couldn't fight this feeling.
Could not.
So anyway, Max, thank you so much for the support. For those wondering, yes, a lot of these references are going over my head, but in my defense, y'all have been slinging some amazing dad jokes recently, so I'm going to be completely thrown off for this entire episode. But thank you so much, Max, for the support. I don't know, fellas, do you reckon we should get into our main topic?
I mean, I reckon. I don't know about Dana reckoning, but I reckon.
It's a rootin' tootin' shootin' good time to start this show.
There we go. All right. So yeah, we do want to talk about, I think we're titling this episode cards you should disclose, but probably before we get into the main topic, we should set the we should set the expectation. We're not going to talk about cards or things that people already do kind of disclose, Rule Zero rules breaks, if you wanted to play with banned cards with your group, or people usually disclose proxies ahead of time too. We don't want to talk about those. We want to talk about cards that are already format legal, and maybe, a nice heads up is kind of nice. And that's kind of the other thing to make clear. We're probably titling this episode should, but we're not going to put a moral point on any of this. Like, we just think these are like, it's kind of polite to give a heads up about them is kind of the real vibe that we're actually after here.
Yeah, this isn't a statement on whether or not you should be playing those, because every playgroup is so different. It's really hard to say what works for Joey's playgroup is also going to be the right thing for my playgroup. And sometimes they overlap for sure. That definitely happens. But everybody has their own expectations and kind of carved out like corner of the format, which is amazing. That's kind of the point of Commander. And I think honestly, that's why it's so successful. But when you're going into a new setting, this is where this conversation kind of gets its legs in our mind.
Yeah, very much. Like the cards that we're going to talk about are all cards that we either do play or have played. It's like, right? Am I wrong on that?
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah. So with that, I guess let's get into it. Dana, where would you start about cards that are just like, hey, it's nice to give a heads up before the game begins if these cards are in your deck?
I think the first thing I would start with is stuff on the EDHREC salt list. Not to toot our own horn too much, but like it's just a really easy thing to talk about. Cards that particularly show up on like the top 10 saltiest cards. If I'm running them, particularly if I'm running them in a way that's like a strategic part of the deck, I would almost always mention anything on there for sure.
Yeah, and I think that this too, it also applies mostly to kind of the casual side of the format, the social aspect of the format. Just kind of the Rule Zero conversation can be so expansive, and honestly, I think that's kind of why I respect CEDH so much, is because the Rule Zero conversation there, I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, but it happens in 4 letters. It's CEDH. Automatically, everyone's expectations are set. Like that's all they need. Whereas the other, I would say like 98% of the format, there's so much gray area, and that's where I think this conversation also kind of comes into play.
And I think what's interesting or what's noteworthy about the salt list in particular is the cards on there are almost always a signpost of a strategy that's probably going to be, something worth giving folks a heads up about.
Sure.
In a way that maybe other cards aren't. Blind Obedience is definitely a stacks card, but Blind Obedience, I wouldn't say is a signpost for stacks the way Stasis or Winter Orb are. And those are 2 cards on the salt list. And I think partially because they're indicative of a way the deck is going to play in a way that Blind Obedience maybe is not. I don't worry too much about disclosing. If I have Blind Obedience in a deck, I would almost always disclose if I had a Stasis in a deck.
Yeah, to me, this is the function of the salt list. Like the salt voting that EDHREC does every year is always really enjoyable, and people love doing those voting. It's a fun tradition each year to do that, because you also discover some really fun cards that way. And I love that also, like, there are cool integrations. Like on Architect, you can actually even see a total salt sum on your decks too. Like those are neat things that we can do, but like truly the core point of the salt list is just like, hey, these are cards that sometimes have like people react to them, and like it's kind of understandable why people might react and be like, that kind of took all the air out of the room. So the point of the salt list isn't to be like, oh, these cards make me grumpy. The point of the salt list is just to be like, hey, if you wanted to play a Vorinclex or an Expropriate, be aware of what it is that those cards have, what effect they have on the table, so that you can make sure that your opponents are like prepared for it, so that they weren't accidentally like, if those things weren't communicated ahead of time, you might end up with a game that not everyone's on the same level, and then you don't get the experience you wanted, and they didn't necessarily get the experience that they wanted either. And so that's really just what the whole salt list is about to me, is like, these are like, it's a great sign of like, let Matt know that there's a Turgid. It's kind of the vibe.
Yeah, just that I can, sharpen my pocket knife for your tires later on.
What?
Not really. Matt? I'm not going to do that. That's an exaggeration. But I do agree that if you're playing a bunch of cards on the salt list, especially the higher up ones, definitely maybe keep that in the back of mind if you're playing a social game. If you get the vibe when you're having that Rule Zero conversation with folks that, okay, they're not trying to get a little sweaty, they're not trying too hard, maybe let people know, like, I have a Drannith Magistrate in the deck. Oftentimes, just being proactive about these types of conversations and disclosures too, they're going to have such a profoundly positive impact on the games that you're playing, because at least you're being honest. I very much 1000% would rather have somebody tell me ahead of time, oh, well, like I have this problem card in my deck. Like I do have Cyclonic Rift, I play a couple tutors, stuff like that. Then finding out halfway through a game, like, oh, this person was just like intentionally misleading me about what their deck was trying to do. I play Cyclonic Rift as well, but I also tell people I'm not trying to like, 1000% would rather have people over communicate and play the salty cards than hide something that kind of is going to create some feel bads.
I don't necessarily love it when someone microwaves COD in the break room at work, but if you give me a heads up you're going to do it, I'm going to be much more forgiving.
Wow. Well, and Matt, that's really just it, is that like, the reason that I think that it's cool to disclose these is because like, oh, cool, that's the level we're playing at. I'm gonna bring up my Conrad deck then. Yeah. Like I don't want to undershoot, which like I'm inclined to undershoot because, you know, if that's the vibe that I'm getting, then that's the vibe that I'm getting. I'm gonna play something that feels a little bit more polite society or whatever the heck you want to call it. But like if you're in the mood for a game where you are going to be destroying lands, then I'm not gonna hold back, and I would love for you to like, all right, cool, let's play that game. But like we have to have that conversation. That disclosure has to happen for that door to open for us to get the game that we do want to like throw down in that way. And yeah, it's just not a cute look when people don't mention those things, because it can just take the air out of the room. It's just like, you know, if that's the game you wanted to play, I would have played it with you, but like, why didn't you say that's the game you wanted to play?
Yeah, that's the thing, is it kind of prevents people from getting into mismatched power levels of decks. And I know it's super subjective, but moral of the story, the more you communicate with people, the better games you're going to have, just because you're able to set Dana's expectation with mine versus Joey's and everything going on there. It's just able to kind of bring everybody together about, okay, what's the goal? And is the goal to play kind of go hard and kind of anything goes type of decks? Or are we trying to keep everything a little friendlier, maybe a little more battle cruisery, whatever that sliding scale is? You're able to find that just by talking about your decks with people. And I know people kind of treat it like, oh, my proprietary deck formula. I guess I struggle with that though when I see people at Command Fest, for example, and that's the kind of the conversation that we have.
Proprietary? I just want to make sure I understand what you mean by that.
I mean, just like people keeping secrets about their deck. Like, yeah. I don't want to disclose too much about my deck because I want you to surprise. And like, I enjoy being surprised, but make sure it's surprise me with something cool and fun.
Yeah, I'm not a big believer in the defense that if you have to disclose too much information about your deck, you're probably going to start losing. I mean, I play with a lot of people whose decks I've seen dozens and dozens of times, and they've seen my decks dozens and dozens of times. And like, I just don't think it really changes that much about how those matchups go down.
Well, and I also like, I understand that, like, you know, there are things that you want to surprise people with. That absolutely makes sense. Like, you don't want to like lay it all necessarily out on the table. But I will say, like, that is sometimes something I've done is like, all right, here's my deck. Here's laying it all out on the table. Like, I want to make sure that you know what it is that you're getting into, because I do kind of feel like, it's just that games end up a little bit better that way. And the plays that I make can surprise you more than the cards that I play can surprise you, if that makes any sense.
I mean, quite honestly, it's almost more satisfying to win a game when the person knows exactly what tools you have at your disposal and they still can't stop you.
I mean, yeah, I suppose so. So yeah, I was actually, it's interesting that we got to that question. I was actually going to leave that question for later on in the show of like, you know, what do we think about the argument that like giving away too much information might impact your play? And it seems that it's not necessarily something that we all necessarily vibe with, and it doesn't feel like these are, it doesn't feel like we need to like cost ourselves points or whatever to announce these things.
Sure.
And I don't think that's necessarily the right, that's not a mindset that I carry into the games when I am playing them, even when I am going to throw down necessarily. And so, yeah, that's just an interesting thing for us to have already touched on. I do kind of want to not just focus on the salt list for this episode, though. So I'm kind of wondering if like a next thing to move into, and these don't all appear on the EDHREC salt list, but like, what do we think about fast mana? That I feel like the mana crypts or things like that are also probably one of the earliest things that you'll see in a game, and it can really throw you off if like right off the bat it's just like, oh, that's a mana crypt is not necessarily what I expected from what I thought was happening in the pregame conversation. So how are we feeling about fast mana and whether that kind of stuff should be disclosed?
I mean, I think just because of the reputation that they carry, if you're playing in a more social pod, I know this sounds bad, but like you almost kind of should at this point. I wouldn't personally, but I know that I'm also of a specific mindset, and just having played at most recent events, like I mean, we had Command Fest San Francisco, we had Magic Con Chicago, and just playing at those certain events, it was really kind of weird seeing just how people kind of would react to different cards like that. And so I personally don't have a problem with it, but you almost kind of need to at this point because of the reputation that surround, especially the fast mana crypt, mana vault, stuff like that.
Yeah, I disclose it, particularly the rocks that would be considered kind of like the traditional CEDH rocks, Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, Vault, Crypt. I don't worry. Obviously, Soul Ring, I assume, is in everyone's deck. The only thing I really run among any of those like really mana efficient, fast CEDH level rocks is I have Mox Opal in 2 decks that are running a really extreme amount of artifacts, but they're not necessarily fast mana. They're just efficient mana. Like I don't really have ways to get out artifacts early to turn that into a turn 1 or 2 online Mox Opal. It's something that's like just a really efficient mana rock on turn 6 usually when I have it in hand, but I still disclose it because it's the kind of thing that I feel like is enough of a signpost that I give folks the heads up that I have it in hand. But those are definitely things I disclose versus like I don't worry about, technically Birds of Paradise is fast mana, technically like a Wild Growth is a fast piece of mana. I don't disclose those, but the mana rocks especially I focus on and let people know.
Yeah, mana dorks, I feel that's a little different than fast mana, the free mana. So
yeah,
agreed.
It's if somebody plays, if they're playing an elf typo commander, I'm going to expect a lot of land or elves. If they're playing, a Bant legend and they play a noble hierarch, I'm not going to be too terribly surprised. But yeah, it's the free mana that I think kind of jumps out as something that I would be telling folks, okay, well, like I have this in my deck, and mana dorks, I would not categorize that in the same breath at all.
Same, yeah. Does this same sentiment apply to Jeweled Lotus, do you guys think?
That's up in the air. I haven't decided yet. I don't have it in a deck that I have to worry about it, but I would probably disclose that one as well because again, it's almost exclusively used to ramp something out faster than it should normally see in play. So I would give a heads up on that if I ran it, but I don't.
Yeah, I also don't play it myself. I don't play the types of decks that need it and at the power levels that need that kind of card. So yeah, again, I guess by that aspect though, or from that point of view, you probably should on the social side because again, the people that are playing the Jeweled Lotus type of commanders, usually they're trying to get a little like kind of bounce around a little bit harder than kind of people would be on the lower end of those deck powers.
Yeah. I feel like also, and this is something I'm definitely going to end up repeating multiple times in the show, like I think like the more cards that we end up naming in this episode of just like, yeah, I'd probably disclose this, people are going to like expect that, like, what are you saying, like 9 cards before you get the game started? And like, I don't think it ends up being that way. I think if you have fast mana, you're just going to say, oh yeah, this deck has fast mana. And that's the end of that, right?
Yeah,
it's like,
yeah.
It actually is pretty simple to announce some of these. And so that's just like a quick thing that I also kind of want to say is like, it actually doesn't cost a whole lot to end up saying or announcing any of these. It's not like I'm listing each individual one. It's just like, oh yeah, no, I've got this deck. It's playing pretty hard. It's got some fast mana. It's also playing some pretty expensive cards in it. That's the next thing that I kind of want to move to. Like, I know that Dana, for example, you've got dual lands in your deck, and you've said before that tends to be a thing that you alert people to.
I actually don't anymore. I've taken all the dual lands out of my decks, in part because it did create a reaction.
Okay.
Particularly in today's Magic world when they're much more expensive than they were when I picked most of them up. When I had picked up a $25 Savannah, no one batted an eye necessarily at seeing it in a deck. Whereas in the last like 5-ish years, that became much more of a signpost for power, in part because of the cost. So I've taken all the duels out of all of my decks. Similarly, I used to run Yawgmoth's Will in a bunch of black decks because 10 years ago it was like a $10 card, and I just ran it as basically a bad regrowth. But as that's now no longer a $10 card and has become much more recognized as a CEDH piece, it wasn't worth the headache similar to dual lands or the reaction from people and their assumption about the power level I was playing at. So I also have taken that from my black deck. So I don't run any of those expensive old reserve list cards really for the most part anywhere anymore.
Okay, gotcha. Matt, what about you?
So this is one I'm coming around to Dana's point of view on this as well. I still have duels in a few of my 5-color decks, like my Tom Bombadil deck. I still have duels in there just because it's 5 colors and I'm casting double, triple mana cost pips on all sorts of different spells, and it's all over the place. So that's the only deck I think I even have duels in anymore. But I also think that this is the type of card that, again, like Dana said, there's expectations. It's kind of a signpost that a lot of players would put on those. I don't think so anymore, just because they're so redundant anymore. You don't need ABU duels.
Yeah,
sure.
With all the rare land cycles, with how accessible so many of these are these days. I mean, shock lands are still the second most expensive cycle, but like all your slow lands, your pain lands, all these different rare cycles, like they're plentiful. They're easy to get. There's a whole bunch of them. And then again, like if you listened to our episode a few weeks ago about ranking all the dual land cycles. Man, there's so many there. You don't really need them because sometimes you don't have space for your third best rare land cycle in your colors anymore. And so I don't think you need to disclose dual lands anymore. I think a lot of players might disagree with me, but I also don't think they've never been less valuable before, just because there's so much competition in those land your color fixing, I should say, that dual lands are just kind of superfluous at this point.
I definitely think that like they're deeply unnecessary. The amount of money that they cost is not going to necessarily measure up to like how many more games they'll make you win or anything like that. Mm-hmm. To me, dual lands sort of stand in as a kind of it's this metonymic stand-in of just like a pricey card. Like, is it worth mentioning I've got this card that is a certain number of dollars above expectation? And like, where does that line get drawn? Because I don't know where that line gets drawn, but I think that sometimes it can incur a certain reaction when people see something that is very, very expensive right there. That sometimes is people like, whoa. I don't know where I would draw that line, but it is sometimes I'm just like, oh, if there's really expensive stuff in here, it feels just polite to give a heads up about it. But I don't think it's like, if you don't, I'm like, if someone doesn't mention a dual land, I'm like, I'm not too surprised by that.
Yeah.
But like just the fact that there are some very expensive pieces of this game does feel like sometimes, I don't know, it's interesting when people do or don't give heads up about those. And so I wanted to ask you guys, and dual lands are like a way into this conversation, but like when it comes to just pricey cards in general, what does that warrant?
Yeah, well, I think I would rather people give me a heads up about a great henge, for example, but I'm also not going to be surprised if people don't. But price per power, I think, which is a metric I just made up. But I would say Great Henge adds more power to your deck per the dollar you spend on it than a dual land does.
I agree.
And it's not even close.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
and Great Henge, that's not a cheap card. It's been reprinted a few times and still finds a way to get super expensive. Smothering Tithe is kind of the same way. So I don't know. I would expect to kind of see Smothering Tithe because it's not been like, for a lot of players, and I know price is subjective, it's not prohibitively expensive, whereas Great Henge kind of has been for a little bit. I would be more surprised if people weren't disclosing Great Henge than duels. But again, this is all my experience, which is completely, like, if you've had different experiences, then just don't worry about mine.
You disclose a Great Henge? That's interesting to me. That one wouldn't occur to me to be like, oh, heads up, there's a Great Henge in this deck.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if people do or don't.
Okay.
But just because it is if you're disclosing cards based off price alone, Great Henge is probably one that like it's getting into disclosable territory, kind of like maybe Fast Mana, even though they're doing very different things though.
Well, all this talk about dual lands makes me think it's maybe a nice time to segue off it and talk about some stats we want to challenge.
What? I'm sorry. Explain to me the connecting thread there. What was that? What was that?
Well, because, I don't know. I've got nothing.
We're keeping this in. I want to keep this in. Is that what we've decided the shtick is going to be for this year? Is just like complete non sequiturs, actually? Okay.
Is just look as disinterested in these segue as possible.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Goodness gracious. Yeah, there are a couple of other things I want to tackle, especially like infinite combos as an example. But yeah, it is definitely time for us to challenge some stats right after this quick break. So I'm going to start us off with Challenge the Stats this week, and I've got a challenge that actually Chase, aka Mana Curves, alerted me to. There was a small back and forth with Blend Blyweiss and Matt Tabak on the online socials about a very, very recent commander, Fibblethip, lost on the range, and a certain misunderstanding with how a card that is pretty popular on the most recent data we've got for Fibblethip, a misunderstanding of how that card is working. So I want to make this a non-bow challenge here. Fibblethip Lost on the Range is a new mono blue commander, 3-mana 1/1 homunculus with Ward 2 because of course, and it says you can look at the top card of your library at any time. The top card of your library has plot. The plot cost is equal to its mana cost, and you may plot non-land cards from the top of your library. Plot being basically a layaway. You lay away the spell and you can cast it for free on a future turn. There's only like 111 decks for Fibblethip that are showing up so far. It's very, very new. But early in that data, we are seeing 47% of those decks are playing Ancestral Vision, which may not work how Fibblethip players want to. Ancestral Vision is not a 0 mana card. Its mana value technically would be 0, but it is not a 0 cost card. It has no mana value at all. You have to suspend it for 4 with, that just costing 1 blue, and it says target player draws 3 cards. And my guess here is that the anticipation that folks have is that you can plot this for 0 mana with Fibblethip's ability. Turns out You cannot. And this was the thread that Chase let me know about from Matt Tabak. Yes, you can cast a spell that has no mana cost if something allows you to cast it without paying its mana cost, such as if it is already plotted. That's, similar to how you can cascade into stuff like that. But with that said, Matt points out, Fblthp isn't going to help you because you end up with an unpayable plot cost. So that is the important distinction here. Ancestral Vision doesn't have a mana cost, so its plot cost being equal to its mana cost, it doesn't have one. It doesn't have a plot cost. So if you are playing Ancestral Vision in your Fblthp the Lost deck, maybe it needs to get lost because that interaction won't work out. You won't be able to plot it for 0 mana off the top of your deck. Sorry, it would be cool to live in that world, but unfortunately that's not the one that we're in, so make sure that you're double checking that one if you're playing Fblthp.
My challenge this week is brought to us by listener Thorbolt, and it's for the card Great Desert Prospector in Emil the Blessed decks. Great Desert Prospector is 4 and a white for a Human Artificer. It's a 3/2, and when it enters battlefield, create a tapped Power Stone token for each other creature you controls. And Thorbolt writes, they're wondering why we are seeing an almost complete lack of Great Desert Prospector cards in Emil decks. For some reason, people have just ignored this card, probably in part because we get a set every other week. But because it makes a tapped Power Stone token for each creature you control when it enters battlefield, and you can then flicker it and make more and more Power Stone tokens, you can then use those Power Stone tokens to activate Emil's flicker ability. So if you're playing one of the many creatures that make a bunch of tokens that tend to show up in Emil decks, things like Reverent Hoplite or Evangel of Heliod, you can very quickly find yourself with a amount of Power Stone tokens that let you functionally almost just infinitely tap Emil, and that's before we even get to things that let you make things enter the battlefield untapped. So yeah, it's just a great way to fuel the blink shenanigans you want to do, and it also scales. You're going to be blinking things that make more creatures that will allow you to make more tokens that make more creatures, and within a turn or two, things are just out of control. It's almost in no decks right now and definitely should see more play. That's a good call, Thorbolt. So thank you very much.
Dang, what an interesting way to get a whole bunch of artifact tokens right into play. That I feel like even like a Ginny Fae could like turn all of them into cats or something like that.
Right.
That's a very interesting card.
Well, I will wrap us up this week then. And so my challenge is actually for a new commander from Outlaws Thunder Junction. Kellen the Kid is just, it's a lot of fun, folks. I got to write an article about this. Yeah, that's right. I wrote an article for the first time in like 4 years. That's how exciting this card is to me. And there's a lot of really fun things you can be doing with it. The article, I kind of touched on a little bit of everything there. But one card I'm kind of surprised that people haven't really latched onto more. I mean, there's all sorts of artifacts that have utility that kind of give you a lot of free casts and stuff like Chaos Wand is pretty fun because you get to exile cards from top of somebody's library and then get to cast something for free, triggering Kellen, stuff like that. But River Song's Diary is a card that I just think a lot of folks kind of glossed over just because it was a Doctor Who card, but it's super, super fun. So River Song's Diary is 3 mana for an artifact with imprint that says whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery from their hand, exile it instead of putting it into the graveyard as it resolves. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 4 more cards exiled with River Song's Diary, choose one of them at random and you may cast it without paying its mana cost. This is just so much stinking fun. Now, I know a lot of players, they kind of don't love the randomness. I mean, if you have a powerful card in there, you may not always get it. There is a random factor to it that I understand why it would kind of discourage a lot of players. But if you want something that's just going to be proccing every single turn and making sure you get a ton of value out of it, River Song's Diary, it comes down on turn 2 or 3 sometimes, and it's just going to sit there and just accrue value over time. It's going to have incidental kind of graveyard hate. I'm sorry, Joey, but it kind of does do that.
Yeah.
It's going to keep all those powerful spells away from folks. They can kind of recycle it and everything like that. There's just a lot of utility built into River Song's Diary, in addition to being able to trigger your commander's triggered ability of being able to put things and cast them for free. So I love River Song's Diary. It's only played in 23% of Kellen decks so far. I think that number should be significantly higher, but there's also a lot of cards in there. Route of Absorption is another card that kind of fills this role as well. There's some really, really cool synergies that you can play around with, and I think River Song's Diary, slow maybe, yes, random, sure, but it's such a fun card though. And so I absolutely think if you're playing Kellen decks, you probably want to give a glance at River Song's Diary.
And like fully, like I also love this card. I think The fear is that like a counterspell or maybe like a cultivate gets trapped into this thing, and it's just like, those are kind of dead, right? But you know what I do like taking? Just like, all right, I'm going to make you second guess how badly you do want to cast that Swords to Plowshares on my thing, because at a future turn, I might turn it back around on you. Like, the most popular spells that are in our decks are removal spells. Like, I was like, cool, all right, that Assassin's Trophy, neat. You might see it later. That's awesome. It's so much fun. The tension this card brings into a game, Matt, I love this.
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to have, no matter what you hit at a certain point in the game, you're going to have something useful, whether, like you said, Joey, a removal spell. Maybe you put like a Sorcerous Squall or something just gnarly there. You're going to have hits pretty much throughout the game after this thing kind of builds up and gets moving forward.
Yeah, it's a really, really fun one. I really like that. And it's great for all these strategies that we're seeing about playing other people's stuff and playing stuff from exile. This is a fun one. And I like you giving it the spotlight so that people don't forget about it, because it's a cool card. There's some cool cards there. It's neat.
Yeah.
All right, guys, that moves us back into our main topic. And I teased before we got to Challenge the Stats that I wanted to kind of talk about infinite combos. I guess that's the way I'm saying it now, infinite combos. And what do we feel about infinite combos? And like, because like straight up for me, this is something that I definitely announce before a game begins. It's just like, if there's an infinite combo, I feel like, I'm probably going to alert people to that. Are y'all on the same page, or are there any exceptions to that, do you think? Like, Matt, where are you?
So I definitely would be disclosing combos. That's where I am at, because another episode we kind of did a while back was uneventful ways that games can end. And sometimes I think on the more social aspect of the format, maybe an infinite combo winning the game kind of can be a little deflating. And I understand if you're playing CEDH, combos are just kind of understood. That's how a majority of players are going to win. And so if I'm playing a more casual, laid back type of game, I'm going to tell people if I'm playing combos, even if it's not combos that I win the game with, if it's like an infinite mana combo or something like that, I'm still going to let people know. Not because I don't think that they're interesting, but because I know a lot of other people, Dana especially, don't really find them interesting.
Although to be frank, I don't hold anyone else to that. I mean, I don't disclose them because I don't run any of them. I intentionally don't run infinite combos. I quit bowling with bumpers up a lot of years ago, and I feel the same about playing with combos. And I'm kidding. So it's not something I worry about. My expectation regarding them would entirely hinge on how easy they are to assemble. If you're playing a Niv Mizzet deck and you've got a couple of variants on Curiosity and ways to grab them pretty easily, I would give folks a heads up about that. If it's, a 3-card combo that doesn't require anything in the command zone and you're not tutoring up the pieces, I have no expectation. So like it's a gray area. For me, like I said, it just matters on how easy it is to get to that combo. And how aggressively you're trying to pursue it, I guess, as well.
That really is a thing. Like, I don't, like, if we see a life gain deck, we probably all kind of expect that maybe there's a Sanguine Bond Exquisite Blood combo in there, but like, we don't call it a life gain combo deck. We would just call that a life gain deck. But if there is a high density of like extra versions of that effect, or Dana, as you said, tutors, like at a certain point, it just becomes a density issue, is the thing to disclose more than like any individual card. A single combo does not a combo deck make, which is a really important distinction for us to draw. The points that, I still feel like, it's probably nice to give that heads up. But the point that I particularly like about it is that it, to me, and this kind of goes back to that conversation we were having about like, giving them, I'm losing points or like, kind of working against myself if I'm giving away too much information. A thing that I really like is that like, if your deck has got those things and you announce them, it's kind of like that Alfred Hitchcock quote of like letting an audience know whether or not there's a bomb that's going to go off under the table when you're watching it, just people have a conversation. I'm butchering that quote, but y'all probably know it. It's a famous thing. But like, if just suddenly a bomb goes off, there's this like, all right, cool, a moment of excitement, but like, who cares? But like, if you saw that tension before, then the entire scene, you're viewing it with completely different eyes because of that tension. And that, to me, is what some of these disclosures can be, especially with regards to combo, is that like, yeah, I'm going to let you guys know. That way it's not a surprise, but also like, can you do anything about it? Because I'm still going to stop you because I am that fierce. Like, that to me is so much fun to see people do and still live in it. And like, can we all take that person collectively down? Those are so fun of games to play.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of like your approach to playing combos in your decks. That's kind of what I like doing just with my battlefield in general. Like, that I have it, but what are you going to do about it? Are you able to stop me from doing that thing?
Yeah.
I do like that type of gaming about it, the gamesmanship, when you know something's coming, but you can't really do anything about it, or you're trying to do something. And so it's kind of a race to see who wins that little mini game there. I do like that interaction. I think that's why I still play a couple combos in a few decks, not that many. I've taken a lot of them out. But for the certain type of game, if that's the vibe we're going for, that is a fun little mini game of, you know that I have this coming eventually, but you don't know when.
Yeah, I just think it's important to highlight that, like, disclosing cards isn't just like a polite thing to do sometimes. I mean, yeah, I do think it's a polite thing to do, but also it can serve a function of like changing the dynamics of the game into this like ticking time bomb that is also a really fun way to engage with Magic. And so like I just wanted to put that out there too, because I think that's also a neat thing that mentioning your cards can do.
Yeah, I think, I guess in a similar vein, I would ask you guys, what are your thoughts on win the game cards, given, you know, there's not that much functional difference between a 2-card combo and Approach of the Second Sun or Felidar Guardian when you know, have ways to gain life. Like, how do you view that? Is it the same way you view combos? Like, what would you do in that situation, Joey, if you had a Approach in a deck? Is that something that you would disclose to the table?
Well, we're talking about cards I haven't actually run here with Approach of the Second Sun, but I have run, like, I've built with Life Gain before, and I've had Felidar Guardian in there, and I don't think I did actually mention that one, because I think I just kind of assumed that, like, yeah, it's a Life Gain deck. These are probably the kinds of things that you're expecting to see in a Life Gain deck. I think for me, the distinction comes like if the I win card feels like it might be somewhat off theme, maybe. Like Athas's Oracle in a deck, that's rarely going to be on theme with something, for instance. But like a Felidar Guardian in a Life Gain deck, that does feel like more like, yeah, okay, cool. That feels like on theme. It doesn't feel like I've broken from the narrative and there's like this sudden M. Night Shyamalan plot twist in your deck, I guess. And I kind of feel the same way about like those I win things as I do about combos. Like if you are playing a Chatterfang deck and you're saying it's a squirrel deck, but then suddenly there's an off-theme Pit of the Plunderer for the purpose of that combo, I'm like, well that feels different. That feels like an M. Night Shyamalan plot twist, and I like knowing when I'm going to see one of those so that I don't get caught off guard by a really crappy plot twist, if that makes sense. And so like I think I view the win the game cards in that same light as I would about those types of combos if something is off theme.
Yeah, it's really hard for me to kind of put my finger exactly where I feel on those, because again, it's going to come down to what the table is doing. So to me, you win the game cards, is it extending the game, or just cards in general? Are they extending the game beyond what was kind of expected, or are they shutting it too soon? Are they closing the game down and winning the game? So I think some cards, like Approach the Second Sun, you have to cast twice, you have to there's a few hoops to jump through, basically. I don't mind that because also, again, you can see that coming. You know that the first one was cast, you know the second one had to be cast too. So there's a little bit of play around there, but some other cards just kind of do it out of nowhere. I mean, there's a reason that they're banned. There's cards like Coalition Victory that they're banned for that very reason. They kind of win out of nowhere, and they're getting easier and easier to do so, whether it's cards like Yavimaya, which is making all of your lands forests, and Urborg doing swamps, etc. So there's all sorts of different play to these types of cards. I think the big thing that's going to throw me personally is it winning too soon, or is it causing games to go too long? And so that's where the enjoyment kind of gets sucked out of the game. That's the question I think folks have to answer. For me, at least, when I'm saying, okay, well, like, what does your deck do? What kind of fun stuff does it do? That's where my question is going to be directed. I
think for me, it actually winds up being a lot like my answer to combo. Like I don't worry about someone disclosing if they have a, say mechanized production in their deck.
Yeah.
If their mechanized production plan is to play mechanized production and hope that at some point you have enough tokens to have it win the game, versus having a deck built around tutoring up mechanized production with multiple ways, including something in the command zone that's going to very easily make you the tokens you need to make to be able to get the win off mechanized production. So the intent, the speed, the efficiency of that win matters to me in the same way that the efficiency and speed of the combo matter to me.
Yeah, and like kind of related to this, you've mentioned tutors here and there, and like I'll say I don't actually necessarily like expect anyone else to mention if they're playing tutors. I do though mention I pretty often mention like, yeah, I'm not playing tutors. Like that is a thing that I do. I'm not like expecting to hear other people say it. I think I often do hear people just like, oh, I got some tutor, but like I don't have a particularly big view about tutors, but I do notice that I mention it just like, yeah, I just don't play them. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of an interesting thing. But I think, Dana, it does come down to that like density issue. And at a certain threshold of them, I would be kind of like, okay, Gorge, what's going on? And like Matt, to your point about like things that extend a game, I'd feel the same way about a certain density of like board wipes. It's also kind of the thing.
Yeah.
Like no individual board wipe is a problem, but if you are playing like 9 of them, I do start to be like, okay, what is this? What is this?
Well, and that's kind of been a hot topic in the community lately too, is how many board wipes is too many, just because of the effect that they have as games are going through. Now, if you're playing a hard control deck and you're not trying to win till turn 20, I would like to know just so I can target you first. But so yeah, it's kind of a weird balance to go about. But yeah, board wipes just have this habit of extending the game a little bit too long for the typical player. And I've seen some people go to extremes where, you know, if it's more than an hour into the game, I don't want you casting board wipes. I don't know if I believe that and agree, but I do. I see at least where the sentiment's coming from, because yes, board wipes having a reset, especially some of the more contentious board wipes. I know every week we see somebody talking about Farewell. That card is a hard reset on the game. And kind of like what Dana mentioned a few weeks ago, yeah, Farewell does some things that cards that are banned kind of do. It's a hard reset and makes pretty much whatever was happening leading up to that point in the game where Farewell resolves, nothing really mattered. And so, yes, Farewell especially is probably one that it's kind of inching into that territory of you probably want to tell people that you're playing Farewell just because of the effect it has on the game.
That is one that like I've that board wipe does feel a little bit different than a lot of the others. And I have seen people like after Farewell was cast, they were just like, I'd just rather not. And they're like, all right, peace out. And they did. They just peaced out. And like, I'm not terribly surprised, especially if it did catch them off guard.
See, I don't know if I would walk away mid-game, but I understand where that's coming from.
I don't necessarily have any hard and fast numbers for any of these things, but there is definitely a point where you disclose a lot of this stuff. I'm not going to tell someone necessarily if I have a Diabolic Tutor in my deck. I'd let them know if I had 11 different variants in Diabolic Tutor. There's a big difference between a tutor and 11 tutors. There's a big difference between 5 counter spells and 22 counter spells. There's a difference between 2 board wipes and 10 board wipes. There's a difference between a blind obedience and 15 different stacks pieces. So I think, yeah, again, it's one of those things. I don't know where you draw the line, but if you're being honest with yourself, you know where the line is, and you know if you are running a deck that has enough of a density to disclose that. Let's be honest. I think most people do realize where they're over that line and whether it's worth saying something.
I've got to share this story. I recently got the chance to hang out with Krim, aka the Asian Avenger, and he was talking about one of his decks, and he used the phrase, and this was so darling to me. He used the phrase, well, the deck's only playing 9 counter spells, and I was like, Crimothy, Crimstopher, Crimathan, what, like, only 9? And he was like, is that a lot? I'm like, yo, you know it's a lot. He's like, yeah. I'm just like, of course you do. And like, Krim is one of my favorite people to play against because he does that archenemy thing. Like, he's just like, he's good at like letting people know, like, yeah, this is what's up. Can you fight it? Like, he loves being the archenemy and having a whole table fight against him. It makes for really enjoyable games. But like, only 9, Crimstathan. Come on, man.
Sometimes though, like a pod needs a villain, and I do.
Yeah.
I love that. Krim especially, just as a player in general, embraces that and is super honest with themselves about, I know I'm going to make myself the problem. I'm not going to get sour if somebody realizes that themselves. And so, yeah.
Very much.
I think that relationship with the game is super helpful because they're announcing that they're the problem, or they're going to make themselves the problem. And that's not affecting how many games they win. It's not affecting really anything like that. And so we see this kind of executed in real life where like, oh, yeah, I'm going to tell you exactly what I'm doing. Stop it or don't.
I think one thing that's kind of interesting about this portion of this conversation is this is, I think, changed over the years. Once upon a time, say 10 years ago, there was a handful of cards that had win the game written on them. And maybe it made sense to disclose the fact that you had a deck that was built around Helix Pinnacle doing Helix Pinnacle things. There's 50 different cards that like have that wording on them right now. It's much more difficult to disclose because it's kind of become a regular part of Magic. Once upon a time, if you were going to go wide, you had Overrun and Overwhelming Stampede and Crater Hoof, and that was maybe kind of it. There's 20 different variants on those things now in green for you to turn killing people with little creatures into a sure thing. I don't know if that's the kind of thing you can disclose the way you once did. And even just like things like, I've killed multiple people this year with monumental corruption that just like makes someone draw a card and lose a life for each artifact you control. I've killed people on more than one occasion with all will be one that deals damage when you put a counter on something. There's a lot of cards that like kill people in one fell swoop today, and it's much more difficult to disclose them given the just sheer density of them.
That's a very good point. And I think also at a certain, like at a certain, I don't even know what this point is, but at a certain point, you do just kind of like, it's expected. Like, of course, that's what this deck is doing.
Yeah.
And like, that is a thing that we learn. And as we play against more people and we see these decks, it's just like, you don't need to, like, especially with the group that you play against regularly. I know exactly what my buddy's Griswold deck is going to do. And I know exactly how brutal it is trying to be. It doesn't need to alert me to anything like that. So a lot of those things can start to feel especially straightforward. I think this particular practice is just that, like, like, especially with brand new folks that I've never played against before, I just really want to make sure that everyone feels delighted by the game that they get to play. And so if I do have to explain a little bit more, even if it seems comical to others, I'm just like, all right, cool. But like, joke's on you, I got a great game out of that. So that sounds neat. But yeah, it is hard to do, Dana, especially because of like how many of these things we have nowadays. But I still find it valuable. And the fact that it is hard isn't a reason not to do it. I'm not saying you were saying not to do it, but like, it is hard. And like, that's what makes it fun to do as well, is kind of what I'm trying to echo.
So one thing that I kind of touched on a little bit, but I actually see some notes that you all put in there. So I want to circle back to cards that kind of extend the game longer than it should, maybe hard resets, or just a whole category of that, of decks. So we all have a friend, everyone has a friend, but all three of us have the same friend who plays a chaos deck. So where do you all land?
And only plays that chaos
deck. Only has that one chaos deck.
Oh.
And we love this friend, and they know who they are. But where do you two stand on chaos decks? Anything that just does those hard resets?
Oh no. Yeah, this goes into your like extending the game a little bit long, and that tends to be my experience with chaos decks. If your deck is warpworld.deck, I would prefer to know that. If you're doing the Scramble-versy things, I'd prefer to know that, especially if I'm playing on Spell Table. Like that's especially the thing. This is actually probably the one that I feel most strongly about. I'm just like, listen, if you're trying to troll, I got to know that straight up, like right up front, because it's not going to be fun for you or for me during the game if like that's a surprise. It's just, we're not going to like that. We're not going to like that. So just say it. And thankfully our friend does say it and delights in that. Oh goodness. That's me, Dana.
Yeah, I think the same thing would apply here to stacks or mass land destruction or hand destruction or something. Like those can be interesting puzzles to try to fight through, but I want to make sure you're in the mood for fighting through a puzzle. And I want you to make sure I'm in the mood for fighting through the puzzle. Like there are absolutely days when like that would be fun to do, and there are absolutely days when like I've had a long day at work and I just want to smash some 7/7s into your 7/7s and see what happens. So like anything that turns playing Magic into not playing Magic, or at least has a potential to do so, I think you should give folks the heads up, and I would try to do the same if I have decks that do similar things. We've talked about my Athreos Pestilence deck. It does that. Like that's how that deck kind of works. It has the advantage of dealing damage to you while it's killing your creatures as well, so maybe it speeds things up, but still, it can create a situation where you feel like you can't play any of your creatures. And I want to make sure people know that's going to happen before it happens.
Right, yeah. If you are going to play Thieves Auction, it's kind of like, well, I don't like being blindsided by that. I'll deal with it. It's fine. I'm not like, I'm upset if you do it, but I'm just kind of like, what game you play in? Mm-hmm. And I feel the same way about like, your deck is doing a Karn lock with Magosynth Lattice. Weird that you didn't mention it. It's just kind of the vibe that I start to get from that. You're playing a Blood Moon? I mean, you don't necessarily need to announce it. And if we're playing at that level, that's cool. But again, just like if you wanted to play at that level, I would have played at that level with you. So wish you'd mentioned it. I wish you'd mentioned it. I get really activated by chaos, apparently. Matt, do you feel the same way that I do?
So I mean, it depends. So how repeated are we going to go through whatever that process is? If it's a warp world into a warp world into a warp world, stuff like that. It's not so much like it's annoying to resolve. It takes forever. And I've been in games where we could have played 2 or 3 other games in the time span it took us to resolve a couple of these spells. And so that's where I think my frustration most lies with those types of decks.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you're playing like actual hard locks and you're tutoring for those pieces and stuff like that, if that's not something that's kind of disclosed with how you're going to win or how you're going to keep other people from winning, I would be a little frustrated for sure. The hard locks is, especially on the social side of the format, that's not very social to me. It's anything that's reducing players, again, the agency that players have in the games. And if you're taking that away from everybody pretty simultaneously, that's where I'm kind of like, okay, this is not what I signed up for.
Right, and like sometimes it's evident. You see a Tiny Bones or a Turgid in the command zone, and you're like, I know exactly what game to expect here. But if you're not expecting a Narset into a wheel and then suddenly you have no cards in your hand, and like that produces a different game state, and it's kind of like, well, a minute ago we were all having a good time, and now I think only you're having a good time, and that isn't necessarily what we all came to Commander for, especially because so many of us only get to play Commander like sometimes only a couple of times per month, if that. So it doesn't make sense to do those to me without like letting people know, hey, I really want to throw down. So just say it.
Similarly, extra turns function the same way really often. I mean, in the best case scenario, you're taking an extra turn, which can be time consuming, but like the amount of time someone just has a time warp or something in their deck and takes an extra turn versus like having plans to loop that repeatedly or running multiple time extra turn effects, very often the latter is the situation. And I definitely like, again, you're monopolizing people's game time. They're coming to play Magic and you're the only person playing Magic. I think you should give a heads up on that. I have a Metamai the Ageless in my Sphinx deck, and Metamai's capped at 1 extra turn because of how it's worded. I still give folks a heads up about that, particularly if it's someone I had never played with before.
Interesting. I think for me, extra turns, that like expropriate notwithstanding, I think that can be a pretty big, obvious one along sort of the same lines of like Farewell being a really big, like this is like a woe, individually woe kind of card, but like most extra turn spells don't tend to function that way for me. I think if I see just a Temporal Mastery or whatever in someone's like top deck manipulation deck, I'm not going to be like thrown off. I'll be like, oh, neat. To me, this one actually goes back to the same thing that we're talking about with tutors, where like to me, I think the extra turns is more of a density issue, or the way that you're describing it, Dana, if the entire deck is actually built around making that the loop, for example. That tends to be my line on it. And like no individual extra turn spell is ever going to make me give any side eye. It's only when like the density or the game plan being shaped around them kind of enters the conversation that I think I start to raise an eyebrow, maybe. But that's, yeah. And extra turns is such an interesting one.
Yeah, and I think the problem with extra turns is the same as decks that lock people out. It just turns into one player is taking up a disproportionate amount of time compared to the rest of the table in that certain game. And I know that there's certain decks like Narset and Light and Master. That's kind of what that deck does. But also that commander being in the command zone, it kind of signals to everybody, this is what I'm going to be up to. It's kind of like the Turgid effect where you know exactly what's going on. So you have a chance to interact before the game starts. And so I understand what the frustration. I used to have a Narset deck, but that deck was only brought out when I sat down with my play group and it was, hey, are we going to bump uglies? Are we going to like get sweaty with each other? And that's when Narset would come out. So it was a very much agreed upon experience that's what we were doing for that certain game. That's when I don't think it comes to mind. And that's again, why CDH is so successful, because that's, you know what you're signing up for. Whereas on the social aspect, those decks that take up everybody else's time, that's where I think folks kind of get a little salty. And maybe, yeah, if you're playing these time walk effects, you probably want to tell people that you're playing them.
And I think that right there is a good final point for us to like kind of hone in on, like a good ending note of the conversation. I guess for us to linger on for a moment here is that like your commander does communicate so many of these things beforehand.
So many.
So like it's not like you actually tend to have to do all of that much disclosing in a lot of these. Like when I bring up my Will Health deck, the Rule Zero conversation is actually pretty easy because all I do is I mention it's like, oh, is zombies. I want to go RAR. I don't have any of the Will Health combos. I'm not playing any tutors in this deck. I'm going to play a lot of zombie tokens and they're going to eat you. Like that's kind of all that tends to be, compared to like if I'm playing Conrad, I'm going to be like, all right, this one, this one I'm going pretty hard. Like, this is something that I'm going to try and take you down before turn 7, maybe is a thing that, or like the Mimiplasm. Like, yeah, I'll put a whole bunch of stuff into my graveyard, and Mimiplasm is going to one-shot you. Like, but the commander also is already doing so much to communicate a lot of that on my behalf that it really only tends to be if there are those exceptions that I might bring anything else into that conversation. I do think that, like, especially with the CEDH example, and especially with like the commanders communicating so much, these conversations and disclosing stuff, it doesn't actually take up all that much time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of specific things we talked about here, but like they don't all exist in the same deck. You are not running a deck that requires you to talk about all of your fast mana and all of your mass land destruction and all of your stacks and all of your counter spells.
Exactly.
There's just not enough slots in a deck to require you to disclose all of those things. This is almost always a thing you can do in just like 10 seconds. I just, the amount of situations where I haven't been able to talk about all of my red flags in a single breath, that's just how it works every single time if you want to do it.
Yeah, honestly, like my Mimiplasm deck, that's a deck where I do have some fast mana, some dual lands, but I don't have any of the other things that we talked about in this episode. I'm not playing extra turns in that list. Might be playing some pretty fierce counter spells as well, but I'm not playing a whole ton of them. So yeah, it does. These are not a lot of things that you will see all heavily concentrated, and that again does make this conversation so expedient. But it is also, I think, important to note like how much of the work sometimes your commander is doing on your own behalf, which can also make it important for you to, like, if you know the reputation that your commander has, like Wilhelt, people know that Wilhelt can do combo stuff with, I think it's Poppet Stitcher. Well, then it's good for me to announce that I'm not playing that, just as important as it is for me to announce whether I am playing that, because that is also another way of cueing people into the game experience that you're hoping to have with them.
Yeah, like sometimes it's strategically advantageous to announce the things you're not playing, just so people know like that's not what you're trying to do, especially if you have a commander that might be indicating, like you said, will help with a Papa Stitcher combo. Letting folks know that that's not what's going to happen might make your life and your game experience much better.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I guess this whole episode is just an hour-long way of us encouraging you to take 15 seconds at the beginning of every game,
yes,
and kind of just communicate with folks. This is the most long-winded Rule Zero conversation I think we've ever had, at least me personally. So, but yeah, we hopefully at the end of the day, like a lot of these cards and just the principles of what we've talked about here, it just helps kind of enlighten everybody in how they're going to navigate their Rule Zero conversations with their friends, with pods, with strangers. I mean, everybody goes to an LGS. People go to all these big sale events. So if you're at a Magic Con someday, maybe use some of these tools that we're trying to just pass on to make sure that your games are more enjoyable with strangers.
Yeah, and I also think, like, once again, there's no like, oh, you should this, you should that, or whatever. It's just like, these are all a lot of cards that we ourselves are also playing, and we just think it's kind of a polite thing to give a heads up. But like, if you don't, like, my experience with commander players is not that they react with an explosive level of vitriol if you don't mention one of these either. Right. And I think that like commander players sometimes get caricaturized that way by some folks who are arguing in bad faith. And it's just like, that's not what happens. If someone pulls out a thing where I'm just like, oh, I wasn't expecting that, that's the game we're playing now, I'm a little bit like, I would have preferred to know that you were doing that, but like, I'm still just game. Like, okay, is the game. This is not a thing that is taken particularly seriously. This is just a thing that we wanted to focus on because, like Matt said, we're hoping that you can get the best game possible, and we think that this is a really cool way to get the best games possible. Yeah,
it's the kind of thing that you can do that will make your game experiences better. And I think, like, at the end of the day, that's what we all want, is to have our game experience be the best experience it can be.
That's what this podcast is about. Things you can do to make your games better. Ooh, we get to talk about the Magic cards. This is fun.
Well, Joey, I don't know about all that, but I do think that we can talk about wrapping it up, because we have talked for a little bit. Why don't we just do a little send-off here? How about that?
Yeah. Real quick, though, I have one last thing that I have to say, coming full circle from the beginning of the show. Patient. All right, yeah, and with that, we're going to call this episode to a close. Gosh. Playing the long con on that one. Fellas,
Tim Curry is so proud of you right now.
Thank you. Listeners, we got to hear from you about cards that you think maybe should have been a part of this conversation too. What are cards that you do disclose? Are there cards that you think like, nah, it's silly to bring that up? Let us know where you're at. And fellas, if our listeners want to get in touch with us, where can they find us online? Matt?
So you can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud members of Team Ultimate Guard, so make sure you check them out for all the best deck accessories, sleeves, boxes, and more.
And Dana.
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, just like Matt Morgan is doing once again. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
It only took me 4 years to write an article.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me at Joseph M. Schultz online, most likely being a fool on Instagram. I have a lot of fun over there. And you can find the cast at EDHRECast everywhere online. Plus, if you got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Our thanks go out once again to Chase for their fantastic work in the post-production of the show. You can find them online at Mana Curves. And listeners, we'll be back at you next week with more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.